Hey guys, I'm back with another video today. So this is part three of the Texas Grand Chess Circuit, and I'd had a bit of a difficult start. I started 2 out of 5, so my live rating was at 2380, which is a big drop considering I was 2400 at the start of the event. But I still had four more games to go, and we're gonna see how those games went in this video. I also talked with my good friend Emil Stefanov before this round. He's a chess player I'd known for like quite a while, and he's also another international master. He gave me some advice, so I was kind of ready to get into this game, and now we're gonna see how the games went. So my first round was against Logan Schaefer. He's a high schooler actually, around 2200 FIDE rated right now. He was around like 2130 at the time of this game, but he had a very good tournament, so he went up. But let's get into the game. So I prepared for Logan's Catalan, so this move, pawn e4, which he played, came as a bit of a shock to me. I'd prepared for the Catalan. For example, this would be a Catalan right here. This is what Logan generally plays, and he's pretty confident in his Catalan. So I guess maybe he wanted to play a little bit more dynamic against me, or maybe play for the win, so he decided to go e4. And I had no preparation here, so I was actually on my own already. Therefore, I decided to meet pawn e4 with pawn e5, and because this is a pretty solid move, and I know how to play pawn e5, even though I did not really prepare this. So after knight f3, I played into a typical close Roy Lopez. This is probably like the most popular position after three moves in all of chess. So, of course, I've played these positions many times before. After my opponent played bishop a4, however, I decided to not opt for the main line with knight f6, because this could lead to, like, I could have walked into his preparation, and I really didn't want to do that. And after the game, he did tell me that he had some stuff prepared, so in hindsight, I think I made the right decision by playing d6. It's the second most popular move here. It's not as popular as knight f6, but d6 still has a clear idea. I want to put my bishop on d7 and then maybe put my pawn on g6 and my bishop on g7. And the idea there is that I'm sort of playing like a King's Indian. I'm playing very solid, and it gives me chances to win the game. So nothing to complain about here. Here Logan played c4. So c4 is the first like really interesting move of the game. We're still well within the theoretical bounds of chess. Other moves include like castles, which obviously is a normal move, simply just completing development. c3 preparing d4 in some situations, also very normal. And bishop takes c6, basically saying that since I don't have a pawn on d6, I have to recapture the b pawn, after which white can play d4. And here after d4, yeah, this theory has been played quite a bit, but I think that the general consensus is that white is usually pretty happy here. So, yeah, my opponent plays c4, and I decide to go pawn g6, which really is not a great move here. The main move was bishop g4. The idea here is after my opponent played pawn h3, I can give up my bishop pair, but in return, I get some really good scores for my knights. For example, the scores on d4 and c5. They're really good for my knights. Yeah, pawn g6, I was kind of just trying to develop my pieces with like bishop g7, fianchetto, maybe put my knight on e7 and my bishop on g4. But unfortunately, it did not seem to work out in my favor according to the engine, because after d4 takes and knight takes d4, white already has a bit of an advantage. This is due to the fact that after we trade off some pieces, white will have a space advantage with his pawns on e4 and c4, and I have weak dark squares around my king. My double pawns are also not something to really be proud of here. So, but he didn't go knight takes d4. Instead, he went queen takes d4. And here I can go knight f6. Like, a move like f6 is really not playable here because I'm just far too passive. These positions can technically be played if you really want to, but it's not something I was looking for in this game, and I wouldn't really recommend like playing this passive. So I played knight f6. And here my opponent played bishop g5. So you can already see that there's three different pins for white. So one pin starts with his bishop on g5 and pins the queen on d8, or pins the knight on f6 to the queen on d8. Another pin starts with his a4 bishop and it pins the knight on c6 to my king on e8. And the last pin starts with his queen on d4 and pins the knight to the rook on h8. So in this situation, there's actually many pins for white, and it does look pretty scary for at first, but the engine actually says that black is equal here after bishop g7, which I didn't play in the game, and this is due to the fact that I was a little bit scared of white going e5, just blowing everything up. D takes e5 would already be a bad move, because here white can trade off queens, and after a move like knight c3, he's preparing to castle long. Knight d5 is a potential threat, like bishop takes c6, removing the defender of the e5 pawn, and then knight takes e5 is also coming. So overall, it's really just not so easy for me to play this position, and the engine already says plus 1.3, meaning that even though I'm currently up a pawn, white's overall position is highly advantageous for him. So after pawn e5, I go pawn b5, and pawn b5 is like a pretty strong move that my opponent missed. Well, actually, first I went bishop e7, and now he still could have gotten advantage by playing bishop takes c6, and after b takes c6, went knight c3, because once again, white has a big space advantage, right? And also the scores around my king are pretty weak, so if I ever castle, then he could probably take advantage of the fact that I castled by moving his bishop to h6 or something like that. Instead, he goes pawn e5, and I meet pawn e5 with the move pawn b5, which I think my opponent had really overlooked because, or well, he saw this in the game, but he might have overlooked how strong it is. The idea is that, first of all, he can't take my knight because his queen is hanging. So he has to move his queen. If he takes my pawn, I'll also take his queen. So he had to go queen h4, which I actually calculated in the game for him. And the idea is if I take his bishop, my knight is going to be hanging, and that would not be good for me. For example, like this would already be a really bad situation for me here. And now I'd be forced to block with the knight, the check, and I'm going to be like lost here because the pawn on f6 is just way too dangerous. It just covers all the scores for my bishop, and my king is out in the open. So after queen e3, which my opponent played instead of queen h4 would have been a better try, but instead he goes queen e3. And on queen e3, I had a really nice response here. I played knight g4. And now there's a lot of chaos in this position, but already the calculations simply just work out for black here. For example, if my opponent takes my bishop, I don't take his queen immediately because then he'll take my queen and then things will liquidate into like an equalish sort of position. Maybe I have a slight advantage, but I could get a little bit more, right? For example, this is not really what I was aiming for because here the position would be around equal. Instead, I have a better way. So when my opponent goes queen e4, or when he goes bishop takes e7, I can go queen takes e7, and I can simply take back the pawn on e5 with the idea of his bishop is really under attack here, and for example, actually maybe queen takes a8 is possible here, so maybe knight takes e5 is not the best, but okay, the computer is giving this line with like, yeah, I have knight d3 check, and then I'm going to take his b2 pawn. His bishop will be hanging at the end, and we can kind of see that when all the captures and all the forcing moves end, I'm up by 2 pawns here. So this would have been a good way from the game to go. And instead, my opponent does see that, and he still goes like queen e4 here, not taking on e7, because he knew that the complications would work out for me. So I go pawn to d5, which is not the best move. So I'm going to show you guys some really interesting lines here. For example, like bishop takes g5 was the best move, and actually I did miscalculate this line in the game. So what I saw after bishop takes g5 was I saw that white could go queen takes c6, and after bishop d7, here I wrongly assumed that that white would be okay. But what I can do is I can simply castle, and white simply does not really have a good square for his bishop. If he moves his bishop back, what I'm going to do is I just have a huge lead in development. I'm going to take the e5 pawn next, and his pieces are just completely stuck on the back rank. His king is not even castled. And overall, this is just a really, really good position for black. So I definitely overlooked that. And I think there was a couple of other calculation mistakes that I might have made here. Like on e takes d6 check, I also was a little bit concerned of what to do. But I actually have this amazing move, knight c to e5. And this hangs multiple pieces. First of all, the knight on e5 is hanging because white has two attackers. And also the rook on a8 is hanging as well. So it's pretty funny that such a move can be so good and can be completely winning for black. But an example line is if white takes my rook, I have knight d3 check. And if white moves the king, what I can do is I can castle. And white is so underdeveloped that even though I lost my rook on a8 and white is up 3 points of material, he's completely lost. Because what is 3 points of material when none of your pieces are doing anything, right? So after knight c5, he could also take on e5. This was possible. And now I have the amazing move castles. And this hangs my knight on g4 and my rook on a8. So, like, there's so many pieces hanging here. Like, the pawn on c4 is hanging, the bishop on a4 is hanging, the pawn on d6 is hanging, the rook on a8 is hanging, and the knight on g4 is hanging. And I'm making a simple move like castles. And that kind of goes to show how important king safety is in chess. Because once again, if you get checkmated, it doesn't matter how many material points you're up, the game is over. So if he went queen takes rook, what I would do is I'd take his knight. And then after bishop c2, I have this really nice move, bishop c1, once again highlighting his lack of development. And my threat is to simply go bishop takes b2 and attack his rook on a1 where it will be trapped. So that was one possible way for the game to continue. I unfortunately did not calculate all of these lines properly, and then I played pawn to d5. So pawn to d5, this move, I am a little bit critical about it right now, but it was still a pretty good move in the game, and it secures black an advantage. The idea here is that if white takes on d5, which he did in the game, well, first of all, he still can't take my bishop on e7, because now, after I take his queen, you can kind of see here that he's going to be down a piece because, first of all, his knight is under attack and his bishop is under attack. And unfortunately for him, there's no way to save both of those pieces. So in that situation, my opponent played queen takes d5. And here the way that I responded was I took his queen and then I calculated all of this. This is all pretty forcing. A bunch of captures. So now there have been like 5 captures in a row and we have transposed into a very interesting endgame. So this is one of the most important parts of chess, understanding that you need to reevaluate the position when the nature of the game changes drastically. So what ended up happening here is that a lot of pieces have come off the board. So since a lot of pieces have come off the board, that really means that we're into an endgame now. And since we're into an endgame, we have to look at, okay, which side is better and why? Well, first of all, he still has no pieces developed, and the g4 pawn is hanging, the d5 pawn is potentially weak, and the b2 pawn, once I go rook b8, attacking it will also be weak. So here my opponent plays knight c3. An example of why he couldn't protect this pawn is because if he played h3, I'd go rook b8, and after knight c3, I'd capture his pawn. And if he tried to capture my pawn, rook c2, and this is some very nice geometry here, where white's knight is on the edge of the board, and it has 0 squares that it can move to. So that would already be very difficult for him. So after knight c3, bishop takes g4, knight takes a4, bishop f3. He castles, and I play bishop takes d5. And what bishop takes d5 does is it basically ensures that I am able to remain a pawn up in this position. And now that I'm up a pawn, I need to be able to try to press my advantage even further. And here he keeps a check. I run my king up the board. I'm not scared of him because like he has no attackers. He plays rook to c1, and I was a little bit shocked by this decision because I thought, okay, if white wants to try to draw this position, maybe what he could try to do is play against the fact that my c6 pawn is very weak, or sorry, my c7 pawn is really weak, and he could put a lot of pressure on me with maybe like pushing his pawn to b3 so that I can't take his a2 pawn, and then potentially developing some pressure on the c pawn. Instead, he plays rook ac1, and after I go bishop takes a2, he keeps a check, I drop my king back, and now I bring my pieces into the game even more. And so far, I'd played very accurately, although here I did make a slight mistake, which could have cost me a little bit, but the best move in this position would have been rook to a4. And what is so good about rook a4? Well, simply put, white's king is very weak. So now what I'm doing with rook a4 is I'm threatening to go rook g4 check, and I'm threatening to attack white's king, where his pawns are also, which are guarding the king, are also going to be a little bit unable to protect his king. And they're going to be very weak. They could potentially fall in the future. Instead, I play rook d8, preparing to do the same thing. But I did overlook a very nice defensive resource for my opponent, and that was rook to d6. And it looks like it just hangs a rook. But if you give it a minute, you'll see that after rook takes, he actually has a really nice fork with knight e8 check. And if I drop my king back, he can take my rook. And this, I should probably still win this position, but there's a lot of work to be done. So my opponent plays h3 instead, and he allows me rook d3, which is a chance I do not miss. Now he goes rook e3. This position is very hard to defend. I take his rook, and now you can see that his king is cut off from the entire second rank by my b2 rook. And not only is his king cut off by that much, but also his pawns are two falls apart. So you can see here that both of his pawns will be very weak. The h3 pawn will be weak, and the e3 pawn will be weak. So rook e2 is a possible move for black, and this is what I played, just putting pressure on his pawn. He tries to keep everything defended, but I start playing with my king now. I bring my king into the game. I bring my bishop back from the a2 square, activating it, and now I just pick up his weak pawns. And here, unfortunately, there is not so much that my opponent can do. And I converted this position with pretty good technique. I'm up 2 clean pawns, so I just have to escort the pawns with my rook, and this should be a pretty clean win. So I was really happy after this game because now I'm on 3 out of 6. I mean, the tournament was still going pretty rough, but at the same time, I played a really nice game this game. I thought I played pretty well. I got a win with the black pieces against a relatively strong opponent, and I was ready to play my next game. So my next game is against Sullivan McConnell, and Sullivan McConnell, I think is a high schooler as well, if I remember correctly, maybe a university student. But yeah, Sullivan McConnell is a 22-42 FIDE master. He's a very strong player, and he is like a lifetime French defense player from what I know. He's been featured in a couple of Gotham chess videos as well, so that's how you know he's really serious. But I decided to play e4 this game. I've been playing the London, and it had not been working out very well for me, so I decided to do something else. I go open up with pawn e4. He goes pawn e6, and I specifically prepared this line, the knight c3 main line French defense for this game. So what we get here is we get some mainline theory. I think he'd played this in round 1 against a Grandmaster Luka Budisavljevic, who's either from Slovenia or Slovakia. I can't maybe Serbia. I can't specifically remember, but yeah, I think it was Serbia. But he played against a very strong player, and Sullivan did lose that game, but he actually had a very big advantage at some point in the game. So it was at least as far as I remember. So Sullivan is definitely very confident in his French defense, but I decided, okay, like I'm also confident in playing against the French defense, so I'll just go for the main line. I go queen d2. He goes pawn a6 here. So castling is the main move, and an example of how the line could go is I could go d takes c5 and then castle myself. And this is a typical position that you get in the French defense. Black will maybe play for like a f6 in the future. He could play for a potential like knight takes c5 for once the bishops get traded, he might put his knight on c5. He might play for a6 b5, trying to attack me on the queen side. But yeah, he goes a6 instead of castling, and after I take on c5, now he goes queen a5. And already here we are like in muddy waters because this position has only been played like 4 times in the Masters database. And what my opponent had done was a little bit strange, but so far it was okay because he combined a6, bishop e7, and queen a5. So the thing about these openings like the French defense is that many times you generally want to be careful how you use your move orders. So there's certain moves which work well with certain move orders. Basically what that means is that like in the previous line that I showed, queen a5 works very well when the bishop comes to c5, and black can play a6 b5. But when the bishop is on e7 and the queen is on a5, and then you also have the pawn in a6, you're spending a lot of time making moves that are a little bit slow. So I go pawn a3, a waiting move and preparing to go b4 in some situations. He goes pawn f6, and now this is his first inaccuracy of the game. Although That being said, in the game, I spent 13 minutes here because there's already a lot going on in this position. So he'd combined this f6 idea, which is it's usually rare to play a move like f6 when white still has a pawn on c5, and that's for good reason. You'll see later in the game why that's the case. But instead of taking on c5, Sullivan plays f6, and to me that looked a little bit early. The reason being, once I take on f6 like what I did in the game, he actually has pretty weak dark squares, and his bishop on c8 is really stuck behind the pawns. So I castle queenside. He goes bishop takes c5, and now I go king b1. And king b1 is an incredibly powerful move because king b1 actually makes multiple threats. So for example, if my opponent was to make a normal move like castling and getting his king to safety, he's already losing a pawn after knight takes d5. Because if he goes queen takes d2, I can take, and then I can take his queen, and I'm up a pawn here. And if he decides to take my knight, well, here he's going to be able to win his pawn back after rook takes f4. But when you look at black's pieces, similar to the Logan Schaefer game, black has no development with this rook on a8 and his bishop on c8, and his knights are misplaced on the edge of the board. And then once we also look at the pawn structure, you can see that his pawn structure is very bad. With a pawn on e6, it's a very weak pawn for the future. I have two bishops, and overall I'm very happy here. So he goes bishop e7, and retreating the bishop from the tension with my e3 bishop. And now I go pawn g3, preparing to go bishop to h3. So pawn g3 is a pretty useful move in many situations because, first of all, I'm threatening to bring my bishop out to h3 and then put pressure on e6. He goes b5. I'm trying to start an attack on the queen side. And now I go knight d4, bringing my knight to the center and putting pressure on his position. And here we trade knights, and he goes pawn b4. And he's trying to start an attack on the queen side, but unfortunately, Sullivan is not really in a position where he can afford to do that because the issue is that once I go knight a2, his b4 pawn is actually pinned to his queen, meaning that he can never move this pawn because then he'll lose his queen. So here, he could have tried rook b8, trying to keep the pawn protected, and then once we count the attackers, we can quickly see that black does technically have enough defenders for the pawn. 3 attackers, 3 defenders. But the issue is that after we trade off all the pieces, endgames with 2 bishops are just very strong. And once again, his pawn structure with his pawns on e6 and his pawns on d5 is just very weak. There's not much that black can do with those pawns, and his bishop is literally stuck behind his pawns. So I already have a decisive advantage here in the endgame. So I go knight a2, and he castles, giving me the pawn. And I'm like, okay, I'll just take the pawn. And here we make a few more moves. Of course, after it went pawn a5, I don't want to open up the position because then my king will be a little bit exposed if he is able to bring his queen out and then bring his rook into the game. Instead, what I'm able to do here is I'm able to put a lot of pressure on his position with my queen on e2, and I'm preparing moves like g4 and pawn to g5. And he goes bishop d6, and now I go pawn c4, threatening to open up the center. And already here, black's position is very, very difficult because, first of all, my rook is in line with his queen, meaning that if the position opens up, it's generally going to be in my favor. And second of all, I still have my threat of just kicking his knight away with my pawn pushes, and then maybe bring my queen into the game and creating a devastating attack on his king side. So he goes rook e8, and I go rook c1 here. Basically just a bit of a waiting move, and also overprotecting the c4 pawn. And now my opponent makes a big inaccuracy. He goes e5, trying to use tactical complications to open up the position. But here I already knew that he could not get away with doing a move like pawn e5. And this is due to the fact that I can take his pawn on e5, and I'd calculated this line from basically when he played e5, but you'll see that we make a few more moves. And now I have this amazing move, f7 check. And f7 is a really nice move here. The idea is that if he goes king takes f7, I can go queen takes g7, and this would be a checkmate in 2. And if he goes queen takes f7, which is what he did in the game, now I can take his bishop on g4. And he is simply down to bishop here, and he's down to knight, and he's completely lost. And I'd calculated this line from after he played e5. So I kind of knew what to expect here. It is a very forcing line. You can see a lot of the moves are either threats or captures in this line, like a threatening checkmate. Now I'm keeping a check, and now I'm making a capture. So clearly there's a lot of checks and captures in this line, but at the same time, it shows how important calculation is in chess. So my opponent does attempt to put up a bit of resistance here, but unfortunately it is pretty futile. I'll go through the rest of the game pretty quickly. But here, you can kind of see I was able to cash out with my extra piece pretty well. And now he cannot stop me taking his rook or delivering a check, queen a8 with checkmate threats. So, Sullivan resigned here. Another game which I thought was very well played by me. Like, I played very well from start to finish, and I was very happy with my game against Sullivan. Next, we're going to go to my game against Jakub Fuss. So, Jakub Fuss is a strong Polish international master. He goes to UTRGV on a chess scholarship, so he's part of their chess team. And he starts the game with knight f3. To be honest, I didn't really bother preparing much for Jakub Fuss because I know that he can play literally everything as white. He's played e4, d4, c4, knight f3. Very flexible player, very strong player. And here I decided to go for knight f6, and after c4, I played e6. So normally I've been playing the g6 systems, but I decided to go pawn e6 this time. And this is the reason that I decided to go pawn a6 is due to the fact that I was kind of struggling with the g6 system against Vladimir Belis, and I didn't want to go into some anti-Grunfeld preparation that my opponent might have had. So he goes b3, and we get a pretty solid position out of the opening. Something I used to play a lot when I was around a few years younger, like in my teenage years. And now white did something which is pretty standard. He played e3, queen e2, preparing to put his rook on d1, and push his pawn to d4. And in this situation, the position is pretty equal, but there's a lot of strategic complexity in this position. For example, I'm gaining space with pawns on d5, c5, and my knights develop into the center, while my opponent prepares to put his rook on d1 and push his own pawns into the center, and maybe bring his knight out to a3, or even his knight to c3 in some lines. It really depends. But he goes d3 here. So d3 is a bit better than d4, because d4 would run into letting me open up my bishop. I could go rook c8, and I will be able to activate my bishop in the future with a move like knight a5, putting a lot of pressure on the c4 pawn. So he plays d3, simply staying solid, and actually Hikaru is another guy who loves to play these systems as white. Basically, you're turtling up a little bit, and you're waiting for black to basically overextend and make a mistake. I go queen c7. So far, everything in the game that we played was pretty standard. Most people play rook a to d8 here, but I decided to go rook f d8 and put my rook on c8. So now I went d takes c4. And d takes c4 is an interesting move. Another good move would have been like queen d7, even rook a c8. They're both good moves. But I was a little bit worried because I thought, okay, if I go rook a c8, I thought maybe he might have some d4 opportunities. But here, I guess it still does not work so well because after we trade on c4, I can once again put my knight on a5, attack the c4 pawn, and his pawns will be weak in the center. So in this line, white's really not pushing d4 that often. But I decided to go for d takes c4. And after b takes c4, now the pawn structure has actually changed dramatically. So this is another one of those positions where it's important to take a step back and try to analyze and evaluate what is going on in the position. So what has just happened here is that white has captured towards the center, meaning that he has more central pawns than I do. But at the same time, I have more queenside pawns than him, and I do have an open file. So now you're going to see that after I play rook a c8 and he drops his knight back to e1, he's preparing to go f4 or g4 and start pawn storming on the king side. And this can be very dangerous for black if I don't react precisely. So I go knight b4, threatening to trade off the bishops. And he goes rook d1, just overprotecting the d3 pawn because my knight on b4 is also being really annoying to his d3 pawn. We make a few more moves, and here I play the move pawn to b5. And this was a very strong move positionally, and I was very happy that I was able to make this move. The reason why this is so strong is, say that I'd made a slow move like pawn to h6. Here white already has a big initiative after a move like pawn g4, followed by pawn f5 or pawn g5, white can start pushing a lot on the king side. And it's not going to be easy for me to keep everything defended. So I go pawn b5. My opponent decides to go pawn a3. Had he taken on b5, this is actually a pawn sack, which works pretty well for me. The idea is here I can go queen a6, and I get a lot of pressure on his d3 pawn and on the a2 pawn. He's going to be losing one of them. And his attack is sort of diminishing, because if I can break through in the center, as Aaron Nimzovich once said, the best way to counter an attack on the flank is with an attack in the center, then it's going to be very hard for white to ever create his own chances on the king side. So here my opponent goes a3, and I decide to go b takes c4. And this is very important. I did not want to go knight c6 in retreat, although this would have been fine as well. But more so, I wanted to take on c4. Because if he takes my knight with a takes b4, what I can do is I can take his pawn. And now, if he moves his knight away, I go pawn c3. And even though I'm down a knight, I have two extremely dangerous pawns for it, and black is already completely winning. So after he goes d takes c4, I decide to trade rooks, drop my knight back a bit, and now I'm actually better. And this is due to the fact that white has a few pawn weaknesses. For example, his pawn on c4 can be very weak in an endgame, because as we can see, his bishop on b2, even though it's like protecting his pawn in a3, there's no protectors for the pawn on c4. And if I can never go knight to a5 and attack this pawn on c4 with another knight, like knight e8 and knight d6, this would already be a difficult situation for Jakub to navigate. So that was sort of my plan in the game. I went rook d8, and after g5, we trade some pieces. And now I reroute my knight to e8 after he kicks my knight away with g5. I go queen b7, taking control over, well, not fully open file, but it's mostly open. And now my queen also has some threats maybe against his knight on e4 in the future. After he plays queen c2, I go knight a5. And now you can see I'm sort of starting to build up pressure on the c4 pawn. And now Jakub plays bishop e5, provoking f6. I wasn't really sure why he did this. I guess he thought f6 must be a weakening move for me. But I sort of disagreed with that premise, because f6 is actually, you'll see it's beneficial for me in some lines. And then he drops his bishop back to b2, and this is actually a very big mistake. So far you can see on the clock that he was up almost 20 minutes on me. So he'd been playing relatively fast this entire game, and now he just made a big mistake with bishop b2, a very big strategic mistake. And it's the best move for me is queen b3, and which I ended up playing in the game. And you can see that queen b3 has multiple purposes. First of all, the bishop on b2 is still like under attack by the queen. His queen is under attack by my queen. And also the c4 pawn is extremely weak. So here, if he moves his queen away, what I would do is I'd take c4, which is what happened in the game. But if he tried to take on b3, this is where the strategic concept comes into play, where I can go knight takes b3, and he is just unfortunately not able to keep the c4 pawn defended. There's many lines that we can look at here, but you can see that in all of them, it's basically impossible for Jakub to keep this pawn defended here, because I always have knight d6 and knight a5. And once I go knight a5, he has to move his knight back to protect the pawn. Then I could bring my other knight into the game, and his knight on g2 is just not doing anything, because the reason why his knight was on g2 was because he needs to bring his knight into the game with a move like knight h4 or knight e1 or something to somehow attack my king. But like generally, even if he could play f5, then he could go knight f4 and try to attack my king, but he wasn't able to do that. Instead, once all the pieces come off, he's left with a lot of weaknesses. So in the game, he goes queen e2. I take his pawn, and now I start constricting him a lot. So we trade off pieces, a few pieces. And we reach this endgame where I have a queen and knight, and I have two extra pawns versus his queen and bishop, but this is completely winning because he simply does not have any play whatsoever in this position. For example, after king e7, if he takes my h7 pawn, this is already really bad for him, because he cannot stop queen c2 check followed by queen takes c1, losing his bishop. So yeah, like he pushes his pawn to e4 and trying to create some coordination with his queen and bishop, but unfortunately it's just not really enough to save the game for him. I start taking all of his pawns just to be safe. I didn't want to mess up this conversion. And I keep quite a few checks here. Queen h8, this move was a little bit suspicious by me, and I almost let my opponent off the hook here. I should have kept checks had I played queen e2 check, king a1 and queen c2. This would have been a more active way to try to finish off the game here. Instead I go queen h8. I'm very greedy to keep my extra pawn. He brings his queen back, but luckily I do have king c7 here. And what king c7 does is it keeps his queen from coming into the game. There is still a little bit of danger in this position. For example, if I play the move pawn h5, the position is already a draw after queen b7. So, yeah, it's really like I still do have to be careful here. I can't just turn my brain off. So I block his king from coming in. And I keep everything protected and start slowly pushing my pawns. Once again, my king is on a really strong square, b6. He cannot keep any checks because the queen protects all those squares. He tries to attack my knight, and I go pawn h5. This was a really nice move. I thought this move was pretty badass because basically he's attacking my knight, but I'm like, I don't care, you can take it. The idea is that if he takes my knight, I go queen d4 check, and he's forced to take my queen. And now after c takes d4, he simply cannot stop my pawn from just promoting to a queen. Because even though he has a bishop, this bishop, which is worth 3 points, is completely restricted by my pawn chain. So that was a really good move by me. Instead, what ends up happening is he tries to just move his king up so that he can avoid the check, the queen d4 check, and we shuffle our pieces around a little bit. I start pushing all my pawns, and eventually I do make another queen. You can see I'm keeping all my pawns on dark squares. It's just a principled way of restricting his dark squared bishop on c3. Every single pawn is on a dark square for me, and now I'm ready to promote to another queen, and here my opponent resigned. So I'm on 3 wins in a row after starting 2 out of 5, and I was really happy here. Because, like, I mean, I was still negative in rating. I would have to win my last game in order to gain rating this tournament. But the fact that I was able to make a comeback after starting 2 out of 5, I think showed a lot of psychological resilience. And I think that's one of the most important parts of chess, being able to make a comeback even when you're really struggling in the tournament. So this has been a pretty long video, but since I had a bit of a special streak, I'm going to show my last game as well. So this video is actually going to be 4 games. So here I'm playing Craig Hilby. Craig is a player I've known for a long time. I played him in one of my tournaments to become an international master in the first place. At the time, he's still an IM. He has 2 GM norms. He's a very strong player. He is a UTD alumni. I used to study there as well. So yeah, I've seen Craig on many occasions. I'm quite aware that he was a pretty sharp player, but I decided to go for e4 anyways because I was on a bit of a hot streak and I was like, why not keep e4 going? I don't want to play like the London or any solid openings. And here I was preparing for Craig to either play a French defense or Sicilian, which he'd played earlier in the tournament. But he surprised me with pawn e5, likely knowing that I'd prepared something. And I play the Roy Lopez, and after he goes pawn d6, which is actually what I did against Logan Schaefer in my round 6. So clearly you can see it's the weapon of a lot of people who choose to avoid theory. I play pawn c4. And funnily enough, Craig did not know the bishop g4 move here. He doesn't play g6 like I did against Logan. Instead he plays knight f6, which is a much more natural move. And I go pawn d4. Of course he can't go knight takes c4 because then I'll push my pawn to d5 and his knight on c6 is going to be hanging. Instead he plays bishop d7, but already here my opponent offered me a draw. And I was like, I already knew that I had an advantage because the issue here for black is that he's trading off his strong bishop on d7, which is like, these positions result in King's Indian pawn structures. With his pawn on d6 and e5, he'll likely develop his bishop via g6 and bishop g7. And in those situations, the light squared bishop is really important because it controls a lot of squares on the diagonal. So it's not usually a piece that black wants to trade. On the other hand, I'm more than happy to trade my light squared bishop because all my pawns are on light squares anyways, so I have good light squared control. And after knight e7, I was like, I don't really want to draw. I'm streaking, and I think my position is good, so I declined the draw, and I decided to play for the win here. So I go knight c3. He played pawn g6, and here I play a very quick c5. So my idea with playing c5 was I wanted to put a lot of pressure on Craig in the center. Because what I thought is that if I can just play on the queen side here, this is where my advantage lies. This is where my pawn chain points. I can gain a lot of space on the queen side. And what I can do is put a lot of pressure on his weak pawns in the future. He castles. We do a few trades. And here I am able to gain some space on, well, he gains some space on the queen side, but I'm able to generate a lot of pressure on his queen side. So I go pawn b4. A move like pawn a4 would have been good as well. But one of the issues here is I didn't want to let black gain space with moving his pawn to a5 and maybe his rook to c8. So I thought against that. I thought, okay, maybe it's probably not best for me to go into that. Instead, I go pawn b4, preparing to go pawn a4 myself. And after knight b6, now I go pawn a4, just trying to open up the queen side because, once again, if, say that he decides to take, already here, this pawn on a6 is going to be a massive weakness. So it's not going to be easy for him to defend the pawn on a6. I have ideas of going knight d2, knight c4, maybe either knight a5 or putting pressure on d6. And overall, I am just relatively happy in this position because he has no attack. Like, this is a King's Indian defense where black has no light squared bishop and no attack. So really, there cannot be much going his way here. He goes knight c4. I go queen a2, and we trade off some pieces on the queen side. And now I am able to make some more trades, put some pressure on his b5 pawn, and Craig, obviously true to his nature, he's a very tricky player. So he goes bishop h6, trying to create some counterplay and have some activity. The idea is pretty simple. If I go knight takes b5, trying to win the pawn, then what's going to happen is I will actually lose my knight. So that is unfortunately not working. Instead, I played knight b3, protecting my knight, and now he goes pawn f5, putting pressure on my e4 pawn in the center. And this is a very good try for him trying to generate some counterplay and put pressure in the center. I trade off the rooks, and now I go knight a5. And this position already here is a bit complicated. Of course, I'm still better because like all the play is happening on the queen side. His pawn on b5 is very weak. You could say the same about my pawn on b4, but he has no way to attack it, right? So it doesn't really matter. And here, Craig makes a very big mistake. He goes f takes e4, likely expecting me to go queen takes e4. Or then he could play like queen b6 or queen a6, even queen d7. He has a variety of moves. But he missed that I could go knight takes e4. And the idea here is that if queen takes d5, I have knight f6 check, forking his king and his queen. And I'm going to win his queen. And if he goes queen b6, I can go queen h3, which is what happened in the game. Now I start playing very actively. I'm threatening to bring my queen into e6. I'm threatening to attack his bishop on h6. And Craig is in a very difficult situation here. But Craig still has tricks up his sleeve. So he goes knight f5. And here it looks on the surface that I can win a piece with g4. A bit of a tactic. The idea is that if he moves his knight, I can take his bishop. And sure, this is technically true, but at the same time, Craig has this amazing move, queen d4, which he definitely would have seen. And the issue here is if I take his knight, then after all the trades happen, even though I'm technically up a knight here, he has a perpetual check, and the game would end in a draw, because I would not be able to escape the check. So I go knight c6, controlling a d4 square, preventing any queen d4 from happening. He drops his bishop back, and now the threat of g4 is unstoppable, so he was forced to do that. I go knight takes d6. Actually, I had a really nice win here. The win is knight e7 check. I didn't see this in the game, unfortunately, but after he takes an e7, what I could do is bring my queen into the game. And then here, unfortunately, black is just not, even though he's up a full piece, he's up a bishop, he just cannot stop the checkmating threats. For example, if he tries to stop me keeping a check here, I can still keep a check and then take his queen. If he tries to move his queen back, or actually, there's some really nice checkmates here. Like, this would be a good example of a smother's mate right here. So there's a lot that I can do in the position. But I go knight takes d6, so it's not as fancy, but it's still a pretty nice tactic. He goes knight takes d6, and after queen e6 check, he cannot block with his knight because then I win his queen with a knight e7 check. Instead, he's forced to move his king. I take his knight, and after he pushes his pawn to e4, I'm trying to create some counterplay and open up his bishop. I have everything under control here. I simply calculate this game to the end. Like, yeah, once again, never too late to blunder. If I take his bishop on f2, he'll keep a checkmate. So I go king h1. He tries to trade off queens, but now I can simply just push my pawn and win the game. Just going g3 to create some lift for my king so that I can't get back rank checkmated. And here, my opponent is unfortunately unable to stop d8 queen. My next plan is to go rook to d1 or rook e1 and then play rook e8. And there's just nothing that Craig can really do about it. So here he decided to resign. We played a few more moves, and I was very happy here. So actually, even though I started 2380 after my first 5 rounds, after the next 4 rounds, I was positive. I was up to like 2400, 2404, 2403. So my live rating right now is 2407. Actually, it might be a little bit different because I've played a tournament since then, but I may go over that tournament later. Although, this is the conclusion of the Texas Grand Chess Circuit, and this is one of the nicest tournaments that I've played in terms of the playing venue as well. I might put some pictures in the video just to show like what it looked like, but it was a really nice experience, and I hope to play the next one of these events that happens. And I have gained a little bit of rating. I'm slightly above 2400. Unfortunately, I don't have any Grandmaster norms yet, but I'm working on that. It is a pretty tough grind to get the Grandmaster title, or to even gain rating, honestly. It's not so easy, but that's what makes it all the more rewarding, right? So I definitely have a lot to work on and improve, but I'm really happy with the way that the tournament ended, and I will see you guys for the next tournament recap. Bye.